This presentation is all about sampling techniques in psychology. Every time we conduct a piece of research, we need some participants to take part in our research, and the way we select those participants from the population is through sampling. Now, the aim of sampling is to make sure that our sample is representative of the population so we can generalise our results to our chosen population. So as we've already said, we always need participants and they need to be suitable for our study. So there has to be a selection process, which is what sampling is all about. We always select our sample from the target population. Now, the target population's not usually all the world or all the residents of a particular country. It's the group of people that we're interested in, and that's the population from which we draw our sample. For example, if we were interested in attitudes of sixth form students in a particular college, then our population might be that particular sixth form college in London, and we'd draw our sample from there. But the issue with that is we couldn't then generalise to all the sixth form colleges in the UK because we've only got a sample from one college in London. If we wanted to make generalisations about sixth form students in general, we'd need to take a sample that incorporated a range of different types of sixth form colleges, different areas, etc. The big thing we're always trying to do is making sure that our sample is representative, which also means typical. Now, when you're evaluating sampling techniques, it's never enough just to say the sample was representative or the sample was unrepresentative. You've got to be able to explain why. You've got to be able to justify why your sample is or isn't representative of the population. So remember that key word, representativeness. It's what we're always aiming to do with sampling. One thing that really is important in sampling is size. Size matters. If our sample's too small, obviously you can't generalise to the whole population. Conversely, if your sample's too large, it just becomes unmanageable. There's too much work, there's too much data, you just can't manage it. So think of what I call the Goldilocks principle. Not too big, not too small, but just right. And obviously the size of the sample you choose will depend on the scale of your research and what you're trying to find out. So let's have a look now at some of the different sampling techniques psychologists use. Now, the choice of sampling technique will usually depend on the sort of research you're doing. There's not one sampling technique that's better than another. It's horses for courses, really. You have to choose one that's appropriate for your research. Random sampling. Now we're talking here random in the statistical sense, not how you use it in everyday language like that was random or that thing's random. We're not talking about that. We're talking about statistics. And what random means in a statistical sense is that every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So think about the National Lottery. Every ball in that machine's got an equal chance of coming out. Drawing names out of a hat is the way that we usually think of random sampling being done. Now, the good thing about random sampling is if the sample is large enough, the rules of probability suggest it should be representative. However, you'll find it difficult to find many examples of true random sampling in psychology, simply because most of the time the target population is not completely available to the researcher. Probably the only study I can think of really is Baron Cohen's study on theory of mind. His normal participants, so the ones that didn't have Asperger's syndrome or Tourette's, were drawn at random from the Cambridge Register. That's a register of people who Cambridge University used for their research, but they did choose their sample randomly from that register. So the strengths then, as we've already said, if the sample is large enough, the rules of probability suggest that it should be representative. The big problems though is participants maybe not be willing or able to take part in the research. We just might not have access to the people. And if somebody doesn't want to take part when they've been drawn at random, then the sample then ceases to be random if you've got to try and find someone else. A further issue is there could still be bias in terms of certain variables like gender, age, ethnicity, purely by chance. So one of the ways that we get round that last weakness of random sampling, about this possibility of bias, is by stratified random sampling. Now what we do with stratified sampling is we divide the population up into categories. Now those categories will depend what we're interested in. Let's just make an easy one and go for gender. So if you imagine that our fictional population is 60% female and 40% male, for a stratified sample we'd need to make sure our sample was proportional, and that's a really important word here, proportional to the population. So if we were just choosing 10 people, 6 would have to be female and 4 would have to be male. And basically what we do is we have several hats to select from instead of just one. So in this case, we'd have a hat with male names, which would pull 4 out of, and a hat with female names, which would pull 6 out of. Now, imagine I wanted to do a random stratified sample of students at a school or college. I'd need to think about year groups. I'd need to work out the proportions in each year group. For example, in most schools there's often more students in years 7 to 11 than there is in year 12, for example. So I'd need to work out the proportions to make sure that my sample was correct. So strengths and weaknesses then. Just like a random sample, if the sample's large enough, the rules of probability suggest that it should be representative. The limitations then, participants may not be willing or able to take part in the research. So the same really as random sampling, but we've got rid of that issue of bias. Our next type of sampling, self-selected, or also known as volunteer sampling, probably the one you've come across in your studies, is Milgram. Obviously Milgram placed an advert and asked for volunteers. This is often used if the research is socially sensitive or if there's any ethical issues in any way. So people volunteer. Now the strengths of that are that it's very, very ethical, as the participants are volunteers, they've given consent. The limitations though, it's not representative because volunteers are usually certain types of people, usually extroverts, and they might not fully represent the population. A further limitation, of course, is if, like in Milgram and Zimbardo's study, participants are being paid for taking part, then that again skews it to people who needed to earn a little bit of extra money. Opportunity sampling then. If you've carried out any of your own research in college, then this is probably what you've used. It's also known as convenience sampling, and it just means using the people that are available at the time and fit the criteria. So it's like going into the common room and going, oh, I need 10 people, you 10 are closest to me, you'll do. Now, as I said, this is also called convenience sampling, and it's called that because it is convenient. It's very simple, it's very easy. The problem is, though, it's not representative, as the people you find available to you at that time might not represent the population. Systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is actually just another form of opportunity or convenience sampling, but instead of picking the first 10 people you meet, you have a bit of a system. So it's a bit like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or you might say that you're going to pick every 5th person off a register. The strengths and weaknesses of this are exactly the same as opportunity sampling because it really is just another sort of opportunity sampling. So it's simple, easy and convenient, but it's not representative as the people available may not represent the population. Okay, so now we've gone through those, we're going to do a little activity. I've got 4 scenarios there. What I'd like you to do is identify the target population and suggest an appropriate sampling technique. I'm going to pause the video now, and I suggest you do too. Okay, if you didn't pause, now, and I'll just count backwards from 10 to give you a chance. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So let's go through these. The first one, an investigation into the attitudes of school students to a new mobile phone policy. Well, our target population is going to be the school that's introduced the new mobile phone policy. So probably the best sampling technique would be a stratified sample, so that we could have a proportional sample from all the different year groups in a school. The second one, you might have recognised this one as Harlow's monkeys, a study to investigate the effects of separation in infant monkeys. So our target population is infant monkeys, and this would be an opportunity sample because it would be the infant monkeys that we had available in the lab. The third one, research into a cure for the fear of spiders. So our target population would be people with a fear of spiders or arachnophobia. We'd probably use a self-selected or volunteer sample for this because it's quite socially sensitive. Giving people therapy for their fear of spiders could be quite frightening for them. So there is an issue of distress. And the final one, research into sexuality in university students. Our target population here is university students, so it might be university students throughout the UK. As it's research into sexuality, again, it's socially sensitive, so we'd be better to do a volunteered or self-selected sample. Okay, I hope that's helped your understanding of sampling techniques in psychology. What I would suggest that you do now to further your knowledge and understanding is to read the relevant sections in your textbooks on sampling techniques and to look at past paper questions. What sort of questions have been asked on sampling techniques, and look at the mark schemes as well. What are the exam boards looking for as an answer? And remember what I said, it's not enough to say that a sample is not representative and that's a weakness. You've got to explain why it's not representative. Thank you for your attention.